This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 125 of the Here's How podcast for the 7th of October 2021. It's not all dancing at the crossroads. There are serious problems in rural Ireland, but who's to blame and, more importantly, how can they be fixed? Let's talk to an expert.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up in a few minutes, is there something amiss with large areas of rural Ireland?
Oh, it's a big question. And again, it kind of goes back to what I'm saying.
Nail your colours to the mast. Nail your colours to the mast. Say yes or no.
No, I'm not going to say yes or no.
That's coming up in a minute. You can hear if I get an answer out of our guest. But first, I want to give a short update on the last podcast about the conflicts of interest and poor academic and ethical standards at the Active Consent Unit in NUIG Galway. We will be doing a follow-up on that because we've got a huge tranche of information from the press office at NUIG and their Freedom of Information department, and we're battling for more. One thing that I can say right now is that a spokesman for NUIG essentially conceded in an email to me that the study that led them to claim that 29% of all female students and 10% of all male students are raped while in college, they've conceded that those figures do not apply to the wider student body, only to a small non-representative sample of people who answered an online questionnaire. In fact, they said that they had never claimed that those figures applied to students as a whole, and they did a sneaky edit on their website, taking down the page where they in fact claimed just that. Which was a bit awkward, because I had taken the precaution of making an archive copy of that exact page, and when I tweeted out a link to it, they restored that page and most of its content. But, as I say, expect a major update there. It's obviously a huge time commitment. We've been working on that story for more than a year, and there is still more to do on it. And for that reason, I want to say a huge thank you to Robert Donoghue, to Alan McLean and to Aidan Mack, who all signed up as patrons on Patreon recently. And obviously thanks also to all the other continuing patrons. That makes it easier for us to put time into researching podcasts and hopefully making them interesting to listen to. And I think the fact that we've been threatened by powerful people, but never actually sued, that's a testament to our fact-checking. So, for all you other listeners, if you could do the same as Robert and Alan and Aidan and chip in €1 or €2 per month, that would really help us to do this more often. The Patreon website allows you to do that automatically. I'll give details of how at the end of the show, and the link is on the website as well.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Dr. Karen Keaveney. She's the Assistant Professor of Rural Development in UCD. She's the head of the Rural Development section there. And she's one of the authors of a report called Challenges and Opportunities for Rural Ireland and the Agricultural Sector. Karen, what's the report about?
Thanks, William. The report was commissioned by NES a few months ago, and really the idea was to undertake a scoping study looking quite broadly at the challenges and opportunities for rural areas. It is part of some broader work that NESC are doing, looking at just transition and all those kind of wider changes that are happening in rural and urban Ireland. I think they're kind of looking at both. So the study we looked at, as I say, it was a scoping exercise. We did two things. We revisited the rural typology, which was something that had been developed.
Slow down. What does rural typology mean?
The rural typology was something that was developed in Maynooth University for the National Spatial Strategy. And so that was early 2000s. So this is going back kind of 20 plus years. And we chose to revisit that because we just wanted to see, in terms of looking at rural places, what's going on. So
do you mean by typology essentially categorizing different types of economic and social activity so you know what's going on and it can be measurable?
Exactly. And one of the kind of key issues for rural areas, and it's a continuing challenge, is kind of putting sort of rural versus urban and deciding rural is one thing and urban is the other. And for a lot of people working in rural, be it rural development or in academic studies related to rural, anything in rural Ireland and beyond, one of our key arguments is that rural areas are incredibly diverse. They're very different. A rural in County Meath is very different to a rural in County Kerry, for example. So the typology was developed initially by Professor Jim Walsh and Saline McHugh, and they developed that based on census data, and it was very much looking at socioeconomics and looking at a number of indicators to try and categorise rural areas. They divided it into 6 different rural area types.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment, but looking at it from Ireland, I have, I think, fairly good knowledge of rural Ireland, but living in a more urban area. And it might be an unfair question to you, but you obviously did this report for NESC, for the National Economic and Social Council. The question that is in my mind, and it's a real question, is what's up with rural Ireland? I'll come to some of the indicators in a moment, but it seems like in at least some areas there is a persistent malaise, which is maybe partly economic, but certainly has a lot of cultural features as well. Can you tell me, am I just being bigoted here, or is there something, and wrong is perhaps a pejorative word, but is there something amiss with large areas of rural Ireland, or is that a false perception on my part?
Oh, it's a big question. And again, it kind of goes back to what I'm saying.
Nail your colours to the mast. Say yes or no. I'll allow you to expand.
No, I'm not going to say yes or no.
Okay.
I think it's way too complex a question and way too complex an answer. There's different things happening in different rural places. And I think sometimes perception is really, really strong. So you might decide somewhere it has a malaise and maybe there are underlying issues, but go to somebody living in that place. And I think it would be better to ask them what is happening. Do you have any examples, William, you'd like to give me?
I do. I'll ask the questions, but I will give you some examples. And I'll give you a couple. I'm sure you're aware, and most of the listeners will be aware, that David McWilliams came up with really an startling statistic recently that Dublin pays 56% of all of the tax paid in Ireland, despite having only 28% of the population. And in some cases that's sort of understandable because Dublin pays, for example, 62% of all the corporation tax, but that can sometimes be because companies who are based in Dublin sell products into rural Ireland, then the tax is declared in Dublin, so that can be sometimes slightly misleading. But that enormous gap is there. So 52% of all the PAYE and USC income tax is paid in Dublin. 52%, more than half of all the tax, paid by slightly over a quarter of the population, 45% of all the self-employed income tax, and 43% of the capital gains tax. There is a huge transfer of resources, about €8 billion of resources being transferred by tax paid in Dublin to be spent in rural Ireland. But if you were to follow the political discussion, and particularly if you were to follow rural politicians, you would think that it was the reverse. What's all that complaining about?
So, well, first of all, there are urban areas and cities outside of Dublin, so it's not just.
That further enhances that point. But Dublin alone, which does not constitute all of the urban areas, but Dublin alone pays 56% of all the tax.
Yeah. So I think that, something that we would look at sort of from a rural point of view is uneven development. And I think that's a majorly underlying factor. And I'm not an economist in terms of looking at my colleague, Adele Kelly, who led the paper as the economist, and she's not here to answer some of those questions. But so where do you start? Absolutely. It's always the sort of argument in terms of, where the funding is coming from. Naturally, it's the capital city. You're going to have funding or money coming out and being invested in these places. But for many people, I would say, you're talking about kind of the representation possibly and the political kind of...
Yeah, I'm actually less aggrieved. Yes, I'm less aggrieved by the amount of money than I am by the attitude of some spokespeople, notably politicians for rural Ireland, who often implicitly and sometimes absolutely explicitly claim that they're being robbed for them fellas up in Dublin.
Yeah, and to be honest, I agree with you. I think that in many cases, the representation for rural areas could be better. I don't know if it fully actually represents a rural voice. And I know in my work, so I'm based in School of Agriculture and Food Science, but a lot of my work is beyond the farm gate, shall we say. I would do a lot of research in it. It's the wider rural population. So it includes everybody. And the reality is that some rural places do feel left behind. And that is a genuine feeling. And it is also, there are genuine infrastructural issues around that. But I think part of the issue is how we represent the rural. We are more likely in Ireland to romanticise the rural, even language that's used in policy. So it's not even just the politics of it. But what does translate into policy is we're more likely to talk about the rural. So, for example, in the National Planning Framework, we talk about the rural as being part of our national identity. We don't talk about the urban in that way. And I think that's really problematic because we are less likely to possibly look at some of the data and the evidence bases and actually kind of see, well, what is happening in rural areas? What do rural areas actually provide? And I think that some representation is damaging. It's playing politics, obviously, in terms of that's how people get elected, but it uses language around, say, traditional ways of life. That sort of language. And I've seen that for many years. I mean, I do quite a lot of work on rural housing, and that's something that it really is emotive in terms of that language that's used. And I think let's trot in there with two big Wellington boots.
Yeah. One-off housing is seen by many people, including planners, which you might have a view on, as being an absolute blight. And I tend to agree. And I think that it is an absolute cancer that you build houses whereby people are utterly car dependent. Nobody in that house can buy a litre of milk without getting in a car and driving to a supermarket. No child in that house can play with their classmate without being put in the back seat of a car and driven there and then driven home again. And this is held up as though it was some sort of rural idyll by many people who appoint themselves as spokespeople for rural Ireland.
Yeah, so there's two things there. But the main thing is one-off housing is ultimately about affordability and always has been. And it really has been about access to housing. And so what's happened over years is we have large numbers of small family farms. So there's higher access to land than there would be in other countries. If we look at our nearest neighbour and has a very similar planning system in England, that's large land, tenure is completely different there. So we've always had an ease of access to land in Ireland in that sense of getting your site. Now, that has changed in kind of the last 10 to 15 years, but we'll just talk maybe about the sort of the cultural element of owning one's own house. And really, one-off housing really began to sort of proliferate in the 1970s as the economy grew. And that was the time we had the Kenny report. We had all those elements that there was a housing crisis then. There was, all the issues obviously around fossil fuels and oil.
Yeah, but pause on that, Karen, because you say about affordability and about access to land. There's a phrase in rural Ireland that not all the listeners might understand. Explain what is meant by great frontage.
Great road frontage. Yeah. Well, basically, so access to land is also about it's literally owning or at least having a family member or whatever that might own it. But the other aspect is literally, is your field on a road? Does it have good road frontage? Can you access it? But that also was massively influenced by the planning system, which required, your driveway to be a certain size. It required you to, it doesn't happen so much now, but it was very much an engineer-led planning system in Ireland, where it was all about, can you have your parking space outside the house? And so, and then naturally what started to happen was, because we didn't use architects, was houses were the sort of cheapest type of house that could be built was a rectangular bungalow. We're all, I think, fairly familiar with them, and they're houses that I know I grew up in and from all my friends. And you faced the road, and that was your road frontage.
Yeah,
so
but the subtext behind that was that somebody might have so much land, but if it had good road frontage, it would be worth way more, because what was happening was the developed value of that land was being internalised into the price, and it was being presented as though it was agricultural land, when in fact the price of it, or the value of it, had this other element internalised into it. And you are correct, in some cases that was being built for various members of the family, and every child in the family was their space to build them each a house. But in a huge number of cases, whether they were initially built for family members or not, they were sold on at huge profit, and this was a way to make a lot of money.
Yeah, I would dispute how much that happened. It definitely started to happen. There was much more speculative one-off house building coming into sort of the late 90s, early 2000s. That's really when that became quite prevalent. But a lot of that also was, I suppose, affordability. And I mean, I wouldn't agree with it myself, but it was very common. If you look at you'd go in, or you can look online now at planning applications, you'd see two houses, possibly bungalows, possibly not. One house, they'd be applying for two houses. One house would be for the person to live in, and the next door house, which was a mirror image, would possibly be built to sell on. But in all fairness, William, that wasn't the case. And I do want to go back to the point about affordability, because, now we're talking, obviously Housing for All came out a couple of weeks ago. We have a housing crisis yet again. And I think rural housing, that's why it's kind of coming back again in terms of a discussion around one-off housing, because it was about affordability. And the reality was that, and still is, that there's a lack of desire to live, and I'm going to bring up another topic now, there's a lack of desire to live in towns. And a major part of that is there aren't enough suitable places to live in towns, and the towns haven't really been invested in or developed very well. So they're not overly appealing places to live often for people.
Yes, yeah.
So
let me address that. Let me address that, because there are obviously costs and benefits to both rural and urban living. And I'm struck that, obviously, particularly if you live in Dublin, the cost is the price. It's very significantly more expensive to live. But whenever there's a cost in terms of urban living, that's just counted as, well, you made your bed and you sleep in it. That's a cost you have to bear. Whenever there's a cost associated with rural living, it seems to be expected that the taxpayer just ponies up and subsidises that. So, for example, the rural broadband system. Rural broadband is incredibly expensive because there's a huge gap between houses and the technology doesn't suit that very well. And we've got a government subsidised rural broadband system to the tune of €12,000 per house, and it will cost the taxpayer €12,000 per house if 100% of the population signs up for it. That seems to be an improbable thing to happen. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the nitty-gritty of it, but I'm just wondering, is there an association? I'm going to throw out a few topics. Is there an association between that type of demand for subsidies and some other things that I think indicate a malaise in rural Ireland? And one of them that I want to bring up, because I think there's a very poor understanding of it. I've gone through the figures of road deaths in Ireland, and road deaths are normally expressed internationally as deaths per 100,000 people in the population. And the best country in the world is Norway. Norway has a score of two deaths per 100,000. Typically, richer countries do way better. Ireland is quite good. Ireland has 2.9, but you could then go to countries like Eastern Europe and you would get scores of 10, 15, and you might go to poorer countries in Africa and Asia and have very poor scores of up to 25 and 30 deaths per 100,000. But that score of 2.9 in Ireland disguises an enormous variation. And if the Pale, Dublin, Wicklow, Kildare, that sort of area, if that was an independent country, it would by a mile have the lowest road death figures of any country on the planet. The figure in Dublin is 1.6, 1.4 in Wicklow. You go to Monaghan, it's 10.7. That's basically on the verge of being a third world country. Roscommon, 8.5. And there's a very clear pattern that if you're going to be killed in Ireland on the roads, you're going to be killed in a BMW. And I don't mean a car, I mean the borders, Midlands and West. And the type of car accidents are really, really remarkable. And we have these, pretty much, maybe not every weekend, but a couple of weekends a month, we hear about somewhere in Kerry or Mayo or Donegal, several young lads killed, drunk out of their mind, driving at breakneck speeds in rural roads. That must be a cultural phenomena at some level, mustn't it?
William, to be honest with you, I don't know. I also don't know if I'm in a... You've kind of brought it to a whole other level there. I'm not really sure how to respond, to be honest with you, because obviously
the reason I'm asking, and perhaps I'm throwing you a little bit deep on that, the reason I'm asking is because I'm looking at a map on page, I think, 27 of your report, and it has these rural typologies, and some of these areas are marked as weak rural areas, marginal rural areas, and then it varies. Then those are predominantly in the north and the west, and then you have urban areas, strong rural areas. They would typically be Leinster and so forth. And if you overlay several problems, and I'll come to a couple of others, but one of them is the road deaths in Ireland. It correlates incredibly strongly with these areas that you have marked as weak rural areas and marginal rural areas, and I'm wondering, that correlation seems to be too strong to disregard, so I'm wondering what the heck is causing it.
Yeah, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that. I think it's actually really interesting. I mean, as a geographer, you're always looking at the spatial relationships, so I think it is very interesting. I mean, obviously, public transport is a significant factor, and you don't. At the end of the day, the options for transport are incredibly limited in rural areas. I mean, I lived in cities for 20 years and never owned a car and only had to buy one when I left Dublin. So, and it is the reality of how we live. There's the assumption that everyone has to drive. It's the distance as well one has to travel. It's that dispersal, like that on that map where you're talking about it. In Ireland we kind of have a northwest southeast divide. You almost imagine a diagonal line going kind of from Louth down to sort of Limerick, Cork, Kerry, Cork, and that kind of divides the country in a sense. And there's a real structural phenomenon there, and has been, since we've been able to get this kind of data, the census data, there's been long-standing structural issues there. So, if you're going to look at the road deaths, for example, and the cars, I mean, obviously people are choosing. It's not the right choice. If horrible things happen at night in terms of drink driving. While I think that's reduced massively, let's be honest, it still happens. Speeding is obviously an issue. And I think in some ways, and I see it myself because I live in a rural area, people are so used to driving constantly. Speed is a major issue, I think, on rural roads. And also
but those are marginal issues, because in Ireland we have the worst county for road deaths has more than 7.5 times more road deaths per population than the best. That's not noise in the data. That's a very, very clear difference. And by the way, slightly better than Dublin, the best county is Wicklow, so that's largely rural as well. It seems that there must be something going on there. And let me bring in another topic in case I haven't thrown enough heavyweight stuff at you.
That's okay.
Murder, in particular, a particular type of murder, of what are called by criminologists family extinction events. And just this year, we have had these, and I don't want to comment on these in detail because clearly of the nature of them, but we've had 3 between Cork and Kerry alone, and all in very rural areas, all in farming communities, all with at least the suggestion of disputes over land and farm and inheritance. We've had 3 separate family extinction murders with, by my count, 9 or 10 people killed. And if you consider this is in very thinly populated areas of Ireland, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
Oh yes, it is. I mean, it's incredibly striking. I mean, obviously, I'll only talk generally, and actually one of a key area for some of my colleagues in the School of Agriculture and Food Science is succession and inheritance. And it is something actually colleagues are looking at there and would know, again, have more in the area of research. But definitely in terms of, and I can, you can only speculate in many ways, but just looking from the outside in, issues are related to land, succession and inheritance. And it's it's an incredibly complex issue because, and again, if you want to tie it into the wider rural phenomenon, less and less people are working directly on farm. That's simply because, technology has improved. We can farm more efficiently, and there's issues with that as well on the environmental side that we may touch on. But the downside, and I talked about that language of culture, identity, tradition. But if there is a strong, we do with land in Ireland and property, we're a bit obsessed, be it urban or rural, that idea of keeping it in the family. And it's not necessarily land that has been back generations. There's also people that maybe it's only one generation the land goes back, but to have got that land, to have raised the funds to buy it to begin with was incredibly, there's tough stories around land. And I think probably every family in Ireland has some stories about land and property. And so clearly there's obviously incredible psychological and mental health issues going on there that I am in no ways an expert to discuss. But it does show that there's major data, issues.
And neither you or I are qualified to discuss the psychology of it. But you would agree that the data there is sufficient data that you've got such a large problem within such a small population that's way far and away beyond what could be happening by chance or by noise in the data. We may not be able to say what's going on, but we can say for sure something is going on there.
There is something. I think it's specific, but obviously, because I did see reference. I think even there. I think at the, I don't know, was it the Fianna Fáil thinking somebody was talking about the rural phenomenon. There's obviously, and one thing in urban settings, I don't even have the language around it, to be perfectly honest. I'm kind of loath to even talk about it. But, there's obviously been other issues in families which are non-land related as well. So it obviously is, while yes, there's this year in particular in 2021, there has been just tragic events. I mean, you obviously would hope that's not going towards a trend, but it does appear to be very much tied in with succession and inheritance and the pressure people are under in terms of that obligation to farm and the motivation to farm. And that is something I've done some research on that in terms of looking at motivations. My colleague Sinead Flannery has done work at why do children of farmers go to the ag colleges, for example? Why do they get the green cert? Is it about obligation or is it about a love of farming? And it's mixed. It's very, very mixed, where you have to start looking at, there are better opportunities now for people to get employment, but often that involves leaving the locality, even if it's only for a temporary amount of time. And so there's pressures there then put on the older population that are left behind that possibly are still farming. And so unfortunately, tensions may arise around that.
Okay. The one other issue in my list, you can tell that I've got a list on the screen in front of me, this is going back about a decade to the previous crisis, when because of essentially gambling on the price of bank shares, the Quinn group based in County Cavan and across the border went bust. The patriarch of this particular business had bet vast amounts of money, lost, and for that reason his businesses perfectly legally fell into the hands of the state. There were really very angry protests on the streets. The rhetoric in those protests was emphatically along the lines of, them fellas up in Dublin are doing us wrong. And this guy, who was before the courts for a variety of issues and, to say the very least, was not cooperative with the authorities, was being portrayed as some sort of local hero, to such an extent that the replacement management brought in to continue running the businesses were the subject of very intense harassment campaigns, culminating in one of the executives being kidnapped and tortured. And to get to where I was going on this, is it possible that the problem here is not so much that people have not been given enough money? There's obviously large transfers of tax funds towards rural Ireland. The problem is that people aren't being challenged. And the problem is that politicians don't have the guts to stand up and to say, actually, no, it's not true that Cavan never gets anything. Cavan gets a very large subvention of government spending over and above the tax that is raised there. It's not true that people are entitled to, €12,000 internet connections just because they live in a rural area, and say to people like the Healy Rays, the drink driving laws apply in Kerry just like they apply everywhere else in the country. And is it possible that people in rural Ireland have been infantilised?
I'm just thinking about, as you're going through that, for me, rural Ireland, to be honest, I think is actually there. I'll go back to what I was talking about, affordability, cost of living, all of those elements. And actually what I think areas, and we'll just say particularly outside Dublin, I think actually apart from, and I think it'll be really interesting over the next few years, we've had two kind of safety valves in Ireland. We've had immigration and we've had rural Ireland, because for many, and it's why we have such a high commuting issue, or we have had a lot of commuting issues. Obviously, we'll be interested to see how that develops. But when people couldn't afford to live in the cities, they had no choice often to move further out. And so, you're talking about the broadband and all the investment and all of that sort of stuff. You were always going to have to invest more per head of population in rural areas. Regardless, it's not just an Irish phenomenon. It's what I talked about at the beginning about uneven development.
Explain that.
Because at the end of the day, a rural area by its definition is going to be more dispersed, regardless of whether you have one-off housing or not. And we do, particularly in Ireland, have scattered one-off housing. Around a quarter of our housing stock is single dwellings. Now, some of those are up a mountain, but some of them are very close to towns as well. So don't forget the geography of it.
I don't want to interrupt you too much, but there's about a quarter of the stock. About 3% of the population is employed in agriculture. Is that right?
It's slightly more. I think at the moment it's about 6% are directly employed
so the overwhelming majority of people who live in rural one-off houses are not employed in agriculture.
Oh, yes, yeah, completely.
Okay, sorry, go ahead with the point.
Yeah, and obviously that's that low number, that's a national figure. Once you start going out into the rural areas, you would have maybe 20 to 30% of people, in some rural areas working directly in agriculture, so obviously that
many, but by no means the majority. Sorry, continue with the point you were making.
Absolutely not. But the reality is you have urban to rural, you have high density urban to incredibly low density rural, and you've got everything in between. And regardless of where you're talking globally, you always invest more in per head of population, not actual figures, but per head of population in rural areas. It is the reality. There is a reality we have to live with. We've talked about one-off housing a lot. There's less one-off housing being built, but the reality is a quarter of our housing stock is there. So what do we do about it? The decision isn't, well, we don't fund it, we don't support it. You have to do something. The reality is the population is there. What are you going to do? Move them out? You're not, at the end of the day. And going back to what I was saying about the safety valve, I think rural Ireland has been the safety valve because to be honest, we haven't a very good history of planning our urban areas very well. So the reality is you move out and out and out. And so it's about, if you start saying, well, we spend more per head of population in rural areas, there's an unfairness in that, it's actually looking at it the wrong way. It's about saying, how do those places actually work together? How do they interact? Because there's a really strong interdependency. Towns are potentially an engine for rural areas of growth, but the rural areas also are engines for the towns. They supply resources, the people obviously that are living around. So it's
They supply what? Food, obviously, from agriculture, but anything else?
Food, food, natural resources, lumber, all the elements, that like how we live day to day. Also, if we're looking at, recreation. I mean, COVID has been incredibly telling in terms of how we're using places differently. And in many ways, this is a really positive time for rural areas, and it's a time to, you would really hope that we actually say, what have we learned from this, and about how we use the places around us, and we're even, and that's going from how we're using public spaces in towns, which I think is very different to how we used them before, because we sort of saw towns as somewhere you drove to and did your shopping and left. I think we're interacting differently locally, but also beyond that, in the more open countryside, we're using our forests differently, for example. People are cycling more. There's all of those. But
pause on that, because that's why I interrupted you before. All of those things that you list don't explain why you can throw in lumberjacks if you want, but don't explain why that great bulk of the rural population, particularly living in one-off housing, that is not involved in agriculture, should be there. And you're right, the houses are where they are, people live where they live, we can't necessarily throw them out. But do you agree it's not something to be aspired to or expanded upon, that we have more and more people building more and more one-off houses in places that are A, economically, B, environmentally, but C, and I think people are underestimating, socially not sustainable. And I would present as evidence of them being socially not sustainable the sort of malaise that I've been talking about earlier. So in terms of policy, surely the recommendation should be to, okay, we have what we have, but make sure we don't build one more single one-off house in rural Ireland.
Yeah, so funny what's happened, and this is something I track in a lot of detail, what's happened since the financial crisis is the number of one-off houses has completely disappeared. So obviously 2008, 2009, next to no building was happening. Planning applications, the number of planning applications that are going in to planning at local authorities has declined massively. I mean, it was obviously crazy levels going up to that, in the Celtic Tiger years. So what has happened naturally is that there has been an overall slowdown in one-off housing. And currently the Department for Housing, Local Government and Heritage are in the process of producing new guidelines for rural housing. The last one was produced in 2005. So it's obviously very outdated. And arguably at the time it was called Sustainable Guidelines, and they weren't overly sustainable, to be perfectly honest. It was a really political document. And probably what stopped the continuance of building of one-off housing was the crash. So,
but you're saying it's not restarting. Is that what you're saying?
It's not to the same extent. And I'll tell you, it's part of the broader housing problem crisis that we have. The housing has changed massively. You can't throw up a house, and I don't want to sound derogatory when it comes to one-off houses, because I have a complex issue with that. It's not that I don't believe, let people build wherever they can. I do think it has to be managed in a much, much more different way. But part of the problem was a lot of the one-off housing we built was of actually relatively poor quality. We don't have a good history of building energy efficient houses. Obviously the rules have changed around that. Now there's some derogations for one-off housing, but the reality is for anybody who is building a house, they are building it up to that, that A1, A2 level, and that is what's happening at the moment. But the cost of that is phenomenal, even if you have the access. So it brings me back to affordability again. A lot of people are not in a position to afford to build a one-off house, and that is naturally now preventing one-off housing. Also,
so just a factual question, because you might know this better than I. Is the proportion of one-off housing being built, is that gone down to zero, or has it gone down much lower than it was when we were building a lot before? Or how have those ratios changed, if at all?
It's not, and I don't know, so I don't have the numbers in front of me. It's not gone to zero, but proportionately it has gone down. the numbers have gone down. It's hard to, if when you look at the planning stats, the way they divide them up, they don't actually have they don't have a one-off house. But you can kind of surmise when you look at the rural local authorities in particular, you can kind of, when it's a single dwelling, you can kind of, more or less
you can work
where
it
is. But it has gone down massively. But to be honest, all building, like outside of the major urban centres, has gone down. So you're not getting housing estates being built in the same way in towns, and in towns that need housing. Like, there is a housing crisis in rural Ireland. And I think it's hidden in many ways, because it's not, the actual numbers aren't that high, but percentage, it's incredibly hard to get a rental in rural Ireland. House prices in particular in the last couple of years have increased massively in rural areas. And our idea of affordable in Dublin is different to affordable in rural Ireland, where salaries are lower. So there's kind of major issues around that. I'm kind of, now I'm like, what was the question to begin with? How did we start? But it's, I think I'm always trying to feel with rural areas, it's really complex. And and sometimes by saying, well, the issues there's national structural issues, and housing is a solid example of that. And how it plays out in rural Ireland has a lot in common with urban areas, but maybe it just plays out a little bit differently. But actually, what my biggest issue in my work in this is how urban is so often pitted against urban, when the two are so interdependent. And we all live our lives in this sort of mix of urban, rural, but whether we know it or not.
Can I give you an analogy on that? Sarah Palin, back in the days when she was the craziest politician we knew,
those were the days.
Absolutely, made a point of talking about how she was going to the more real American places, by which she meant largely rural or suburban and overwhelmingly white areas in the US, and she was very clearly drawing a distinction between people who she thought were really American and others who she thought didn't really count as American, obviously too brown for her. There does seem to be an analogous belief in Ireland, and whether you're De Valera talking about dancing at the crossroads or tourist board ad aimed at Irish Americans portraying, green fields and an idyllic rural image, there does seem to be some sort of a denial that if you live in a town, you're not really Irish, and the people who do live in these rural areas are somehow, the world owes them a living for that. Is that possible?
Yeah, I do. I think that's there, and it's something, I think it's quite worrying. And right now the language is subtle, but I think in Ireland we're quite good at being subtle in our language. I think politically we pick a tone, but we're probably saying other things. I think I kind of mentioned it at the beginning. Why do we equate rural Ireland with the national identity? I think that's quite worrying, because then it's saying that, well, it's one thing. And actually, what I find, like, our Rural Future came out there is this year as well. And one of the elements missing in that is language around diversity. And actually, rural areas are incredibly diverse. I grew up just, my personal story is I grew up in Roscommon, where it was I think the most exciting and exotic people in Boyle, where I grew up, they were from Italy, that was as diverse as we got. And now, I did the typical thing, left to live in the cities and came back then when I had kids to live in a different part of the county. And it's so interesting to see the diversity that is taking place. There's now generations of people here, particularly over the last couple of decades, who are part of the place, but yet we're not recognising them as Irish, and they're just as Irish as everybody else. And that it does worry me in the political approach, that language that we are using, that I would be very afraid we'd start getting towards that populist sort of language.
Karen Keaveney, Assistant Professor of Rural Development at UCD, also head of the Rural Development section there. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Okay, Kevin, you were involved in setting up the interview there with Karen Keaveney. What did you want to say on this topic?
Well, I suppose it was when we were kind of listing the list of issues in various parts of rural Ireland, the road deaths in the BMW counties, the family extinction events in the Mid-Munster region, this, let's say, rap sheet against rural Ireland, that I suppose I became a little bit unsatisfied with the idea of culture as a standalone explanation. I suppose maybe I'm betraying kind of an ideological point of view here, but I tend to view culture as more of a symptom of things that are more fundamental. And kind of more importantly, I suppose I'm unsatisfied with culture as a solution. I don't know if telling people to sort out their culture really works as a political solution.
Okay, and how would you explain these huge differences between road deaths? Say, I mean, the example I gave was between Monaghan and Dublin or Wicklow. If that's not some cultural mechanism, what is it?
Well, I suppose I know I've had a bit of time to think about this, but I think it's probably multi-causal. I mean, clearly there's a biological element, since it's overwhelmingly males who die in these road accidents. That's possibly, at least in part, due to maybe a young male propensity towards risky behaviour. Undoubtedly, it was mentioned in the podcast that the road deaths seemed to be particularly high in areas that were designated as structurally weak or marginal. So it's a particular type of rural area, particularly west of the Shannon and in the northwest of the country. That doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. And I mean, I suppose I do think that the fact that it's a rural area does play a part. It's just that rural areas tend to have greater car dependency versus maybe an urban area which also has structural problems, but maybe they manifest themselves differently.
Sure, yeah, I would say that places like South Kildare, Offaly, Laois have very good road death statistics, despite the fact that they're quite rural. But that brings us to the point of these huge transfers of resources that are going from the capital, from Dublin, to the rest of Ireland, predominantly to rural Ireland. That doesn't fit with the idea that it's issues of disadvantage or disempowerment, does it?
Yeah, well, I would say that sometimes transfers of resources are explicitly targeted towards areas of disadvantage or areas of need. Just because there's more money being spent in one area or versus where it's being collected, I don't think that means that more money is being invested. Particularly if, one thing I noticed in the report was that there was a statistic called the vitality ratio. That is the ratio of people between the ages of 20 to 39 versus people who are 65 are very different between sort of the structurally weak kind of rural areas and some of the urban areas. So, I mean, I do think that some substantial part of that transfer is just, pensions and other kind of transfers that kind of happen almost by osmosis. The other thing is, I suppose, and Professor Keaveney mentioned it, that when there is investment, it is going to be more expensive in rural areas than it is in urban areas.
Okay, but I mean, taking for example I hate to say the word, the Healy Rays and these other notable rural TDs who have organised themselves into a rural group in the Dáil recently, I noticed. Doesn't their behaviour and the type of things of, calling for the legalisation of drunken driving, doesn't that betray something about the culture in rural Ireland that people vote for them?
Yeah, so with regard to the Healy Rays, don't hang me from the nearest tree, but I think they have identified a real problem when they've tapped into something when they talk about, alcohol limits while driving. It seems to me that, if there's an area with, a large amount of car dependency, people living in standalone houses, this might cause a problem, especially if the main place where people socialise is a pub where alcohol is. And if those two things don't go together, like when the rules get tighter, that's a bigger sacrifice for people who live in those types of areas than people who live in areas where, the transport options and the entertainment options and the social options, where they are much more diverse. Now, I hasten to add that rolling back these regulations is not the solution. And I actually think that the Healy Rays are part of the problem.
Yeah, it's notable that both they and their father before them fought ferociously to prevent any reduction in one-off housing being built, and fought ferociously against allowing any type of hostelry that wasn't just their pubs. So on both sides of the equation, they're trying very hard to make the problem worse, to put money in their own pockets.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want them to wouldn't want their brand of politics to distract from the idea that maybe we should tackle rural isolation issues. And I would also, I suppose, I would like people maybe to reject the idea that the Healy-Raes are the spokespeople of all of rural Ireland, and certainly that they are the stereotype of people in rural Ireland. You know, there are other rural TDs that are nothing like the Healy-Raes, whether you agree with them or not. Last rural TD we had on the podcast was Holly Cairns, who is a different political figure. Even if you disagree with her politics, she has less of a resemblance to Sarah Palin than the Healy-Raes. And I think that, you know, I wouldn't want people to feel that they're on the same team as the Healy-Raes, and that team is against people who are hostile to rural Ireland in a general sense. So yeah, I suppose that's all I wanted to say on it, really, unless there's any other questions you have.
We'll leave it there then, Kevin.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to Robert and Alan and Aidan and all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow us to devote time to research and to finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, and also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.